Thanks, James, and welcome everybody. As James said, this session is really all about the purchasing or merging of books of business, what's involved in that process, and is it a worthwhile exercise? I'll start off by just posing a question to you, and that is, do you believe it's the best time in the last 30 years to be an advisor? Some would argue that no, look, it's just a compliance nightmare, education requirements, etc. Others, like us at Morningstar, would argue that no, it is definitely the best time to be an advisor. And why would we say that? We look at the marketplace in the advisor universe, and we see a shrinking pool of advisors, as James mentioned, and for a whole raft of reasons this is the case, not the least of which is the education requirements, compliance burden, and there's the decision by the banks to exit financial planning following the Royal Commission. Whilst at the same time, we've got the baby boomers coming through. They're either retiring or nearing retirement, and all of them are coming to the conclusion, particularly after the last 12 months, that they need help and they need advice. So these dual forces are opening up a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the existing planners to grow their businesses both organically, as we heard from Erica last week, and through acquisition. Now, the usual narrative around this acquisition opportunity is that there's going to be a flood of books come onto the market as these advisors exit the marketplace. So we want to look at that question. Is it a buyer's market? Will it become a buyer's market? And to do this, I'm joined by two very different market participants. They're going to delve into this question of, is it a buyer's market indeed? And we'll also ask them to walk us through what you need to consider if you're thinking of acquiring a book yourself. So let me introduce the two gentlemen that I've got here with me. First of all, Gordon Wilson. Gordon's in the striped jacket. After finishing college in the US, Gordon returned to Australia to enter the family business. He wanted to become a second-generation financial planner, and he had a clear plan to succeed his father in heading up the organisation. In the 15 years since that time, he successfully scaled up his practice with inorganic growth through merger and acquisitions at the heart of much of that. Gordon's pathway, although not uncommon within the financial planning industry, does enable us to extract from him valuable insight into the unique challenges that anybody will face when they're looking at mergers and acquisitions. And I can tell you that he's actually bought 7 practices in the last 8 or 9 years. We're also joined by Steve Prendeville. Spanning 30 years, and I've known Steve for almost that long, Steve's career has involved banking, stockbroking, as well as establishing, managing and selling national dealer groups and financial planning practices. He's a regular media commentator and he speaks at a range of industry events, including the IFA, etc., many dealer group conferences. And he's also the company founder and director of Forte Asset Management, or Asset Solutions, sorry, a business specializing in the selling of financial services businesses. And he's estimated that he has facilitated the sale of over 150 such practices in Australia. And as he is often heard to say, on quite a few different occasions, it has taken him nearly 20 years to become an overnight success. Okay, I want to start off this session by getting you to think about things before we sort of delve into our panelists' histories and learnings. So first of all, I want to put a poll up in front of you. If you are or were contemplating purchasing a book of clients, what are the top 3 challenges? Now I've got there identifying and valuing the book, knowing which clients I pay for, evaluating the risks, including the regulatory risks inherent in the purchase, negotiating and structuring the agreement, integrating the clients into my business, which is very much making sure that you extract maximum value from the purchase. So I'll give us a couple of seconds just for people to have a think about those things. Tick off 3, 2 if you can't think of the 3, and we'll give you the results in a little while. Okay, I want to start off this session by delving into this question of, is it a buyer's market? So I'm going to start off with Steve. Steve obviously has a very broad view of what the buying and selling end of the market looks like. Steve, is it a buyer's market? What are you actually seeing out there?
Thanks, Peter. No, quite the opposite. So 17 years I've been selling financial services businesses, and it's the lowest level of supply that I've seen in the last 2 years. If you have a look at 2019 and 2020, 2019 on the February the 4th, we had the passing down of Hayne report, at which stage I had about 42 businesses within a month saying, get me out of here, of which only 2 were actually market ready. We've then had the education criteria coming in, so everyone's been focusing on getting their education. From the Hayne report, we had movement to annual renewals, and so there's been a significant amount of re-engineering of businesses to get them market ready or just to get them compliance-wise and aligned. We then, so that was 2019, which we did see prices fall. That was predominantly given the backdrop of A&P moved the Ebola from 4 times to 2.5. Our market average went from 3 times down to 2.5. However, consistently on profit, EBIT based, we're still around the 6 times. But supply just dried up and no one was coming to the market. I think it's much like the property market. If you're thinking you're selling into a depressed market and you don't have to, you don't. What we've also saw was the substantial amount of advisor migration that happened over 2019 and still happening year to date. We had 5,000 people, advisors leave the industry last year, and I think we're somewhere around about 2,700 this year. And that's fueled the expectation that the market's collapsed. But what's also happened is that we've been re-engineering the businesses, and then we went straight into COVID in March. And so it was all hands on deck. No one has had the headspace to then take on the next challenge, which is a significant challenge of actually selling. And so if I look at the business now, I would have 50 inquiries to every single asset. And also in the last 2 months, there's been a slight easing up on supply. I've brought on, I think it's 6 new businesses, which is equivalent to more than 12 months of any previous supply. I would normally. So
if you looked forward, what do you suspect might happen? Do you think with the education requirements starting to loom large, ethics deadlines, do you think this might change?
Yeah, look, I do. I think that will increase the supply, but nowhere near to the levels of demand. The demand is excessive, and it's largely due to increasing production costs. We've seen PI increase by 25-30%, dealer fees increase 25% plus. We've seen ASIC levies. We've seen the need for investment in technology, the need to invest in education. And so costs are going up, and EBIT profitability is pretty much the same as last year. So
it's a scale.
At the same time, yeah. So in the absence of organic growth, you look at acquisitions. And given that we're at the lowest interest rates that we've ever seen, we've got cheap finance, and there's also an abundance of capital around the marketplace as well, because we're seen to be basically in an industry with disruption, so therefore opportunity, but also an industry that is somewhat recession-proof because the need for advice is growing.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
all right. I think that sets us up really well and changes the narrative slightly as well. What we want to do in this session is divide the opportunity or the analysis that we're going to do into three areas. We're going to look at due diligence, what due diligence should and has to be done, and what lessons have both Steve and Gordon learnt in doing due diligence. Secondly, what is the agreement challenges in formulating an agreement, what should go into that agreement, etc. And then lastly, the integration challenges. So I'm going to start off with Gordon on due diligence. Now, Gordon, as I said, you've bought 7 different books over the last 8 or 9 years. How do you evaluate a business, and what have you learnt and through all of these various acquisitions?
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. Look, I might just start with what I've learned, and I definitely learned that the very first deal that I did is my worst, and I dare say the next deal that I do will probably be the best one I do. The first one I did involved succession planning with my parents, and you go, like in that particular instance, without the experience behind me, without the necessary guidance or reaching out, you go into it with rose-colored glasses, and I think that leads me into my most valid point around what I've learned is that you've got to understand your motivations for scaling up inorganically first and foremost. Whether you think it's the best time now in the last 30 years to be an advisor or be a practice principal considering M&A, you've got to understand what's motivating you first and foremost to scale up. If it's just that you've got some itchy feet and that you think you might miss out on capitalizing on an opportunity, or if you think it's going to make your life easier, or if you think it's going to give you that immediate scaled up efficiencies that you're looking for, you're sorely mistaken. Like you've got to be prepared to understand why it is that you're doing what you're doing, and that probably then leads me into how you evaluate your business. Obviously, being inside the business that I acquired from the outset, I had an intimate understanding, but it's not always like that. So. And over time, you begin to form some habits around how you look at businesses. But I would dare say, with the level of disruption that's occurred within the industry over the last few years, that should really have changed. So, but at the heart of anything that I do, there's a few things I definitely look for. So, people, plans, and processes. So the people within the business can speak volumes for the type of business it is. So, what they value, the type of work ethic, that sort of stuff. Plans. If that business plan is basically like a lost sheep out in the paddock, then you're going to have troubles integrating it inside of your business. So does it have a business plan, particularly in the last couple of years? Because then you can see how they've tracked and overcome changes that have been that have been kind of the theme of the last couple of years, and processes. So the processes will really allow you to have a look underneath the hood and see if they are operating at their optimum, and whether there is additional efficiency and profit you can drive out of them, or whether there's efficiencies and processes in place that they've got that you can learn and integrate inside of your business for that scaled up business. But without doubt. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Sorry, Gordon. We often talk about the need to get into the client files, right, and analyse what's in there, what type of advice is being given, does that culturally align to you? What's your sort of take on what you're looking to get out of a client file?
Look, I mean, that's the client files have become increasingly more important in as far as the level of detail that they go on. I mean, we've already talked about the C word a couple of times in this on this panel, compliance. I mean, you want to make sure that file is not just complete, but it also tells a story about the client, so that it can assist with an integration. But you can also, what you can get out of that is the values, or find out whether the values that you share and that you expect are represented in the clients that you could potentially be working with here. If there is any chance that there's a misalignment or and unintended consequences in as far as missed expectations, then you could put all this effort into doing a great deal, but it blows up because the clients that you're trying to work with are not aligned to you or vice versa.
So it almost comes down to understanding what does the client expect from the advisor as much as what the advisor has done for the client, and making sure that that aligns to what you're going to, aim to deliver as well, which I think is a really good insight. If I was to go to you, Steve, on this idea of due diligence, let's talk about the vendor for a second. Because we come at it from a buyer's point of view. What's the vendor thinking when he's looking to sell?
Can I trust the buyer to look after my clients equal or greater than what I have done? It's about a legacy. It's probably going to be a 20-year plus business that's for sale. These clients are more than clients, often they're friends. And they've trusted you and had confidence for the life of the relationship. And so you're going to honor that on your exit. You are going to find the best possible advisor for them and also the best possible employer for your staff. If you do those two things, then you'll look after your family. So it really is finding the best advisor.
So is that your role, really, to bring together?
It is. I like to say I'm an M&A expert, but no, I'm a matchmaker. It's of the 50 inquiries, it's my role to whittle them down to the top 5. And what I'm looking for is cultural alignment. Success is just around that. It's about having the right people at the table. How do you identify that? Well, you want to look at commonalities of belief systems, exactly what Gordon was saying, in values. The first meeting is really simple. It's each party to talk about their past, present, and future. It is not a forum for negotiation. It is just seeking commonality in belief systems. You're then having a look at the business alignment, investment philosophy. Is it use of direct equities or ETFs? What's the technology that it's sitting on? But the real key to identifying culture is actually similar fee policies. If both parties are valuing themselves.
Back to you,
level.
Gordon. When you're doing the due diligence, how much or how important is it to have the vendor remain within your business to help you integrate those clients?
Look, I think we'll touch on this further as we go in this conversation as well. But again, if we're talking about a point in time, as far as I'm concerned, it's basically, unless there's some incredibly mitigating circumstances that prevents that, I would say it's almost a certainty or a must as part of any deal to bring on that existing advisor or advisors to assist in a smooth transition from one organization to another, to ensure there's continuity of that relationship, and also it provides a level of reassurance for those clients that come across. So with the volume of disruption that has occurred, not for the industry, but at the industry, to the industry, the microscope that's been on it in various channels within the media, I think it's now more important than ever. But the big question might be just the time frame in which for which a person comes along into the next or into the merged entity or into the acquiring entity.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about due diligence as very, very much being a numbers game, but this is completely changing the way I'm thinking about it, because it's very much a values and culture sort of equation that we're thinking about here. Let's move on to the agreement. So, Steve, we've located the right buyer and we're matching them to the right seller. Now we're going to actually look at formulating this into, an ongoing agreement. And there must be so much to consider here. Everything from what exactly am I paying for? How do I manage the risks incumbent in doing this trade, etc. What are you really buying?
You're buying the rights to the revenue, relatively simply. You're either going to be doing an asset sale, which is the rights to the clients and the revenue, or it's going to be a share sale where you're buying the actual business and the shareholding of that business, potentials with license. It comes with many other parts to it. But most transactions are asset sales where you're acquiring the rights to the revenue and the client files.
Yeah, okay. And typically, how is it paid for? What's the structure around the payment?
Yeah. Look, the size does matter. So sub 3 million, you're looking at a 12-month transaction. Depending upon what risk is perceived, the average transaction is 70% paid up front, 30% deferred, paid in 12 months' time, depending upon the actual recurring revenue that's generated. Now, just a small point, but the valuation may have been done on profitability, but the contract will be done mirroring recurring revenue, because recurring revenue is the best indicator of client retention. Plus, the new owner has their own cost structures. So they may have done the valuation of your business on earnings or profitability, but contractually it'll be in following recurring revenue for the deferred payment.
Yeah. So you can see just immediately the importance of keeping the vendor in the ongoing entity for a period of time. How do you ensure that's the case?
Well, one is that you've got 30% deferred. So on $1 million transaction, there's 300,000 that's dependent upon client retention. So both parties are absolutely aligned with a common goal that they want all the clients there at the end of the 12 months. So that's the first one. And if it's more than 3 million, then you're probably looking at, a 2-year transaction. And it could be, 70, 15, 15. Depending upon risk perspectives.
And staff come into that kind of equation as well?
Yeah, so I think Gordon referenced, less disruption as possible. You want very little ripples. You want very little change on the acquisition of that business, at least from the front end. There'll be a lot of things happening below the water, but you want it to be as close to normal or the maintenance of status quo as possible. And part of that is retention of staff, particularly those that are client interfacing. One of the roles that are often underestimated is actually reception. The meet, the greet, oh yes, you have a long black, a latte, how are the kids, how was your holiday pre-COVID? That intimacy is all part of the fabric of the culture of the business. And so, and whilst the principal is not necessarily saying that they've sold, they've merged, I'm staying around, what you're looking for is those secondary or primary relationships that are going to ensure or certainly allow enrichment of that client relationship in the handover.
Yeah. Gordon, agreements, staff retention, vendor retention. What's your and what's really worked?
Yeah, look, it's funny you say what's really worked. It's actually probably what hasn't worked that's taught me the most. I mean, like with just about anything in our lives, we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. So, I tend to just agree. I tend to agree with a lot of what Steve just said. Either by sheer happenstance or blind luck, or through some exploration of my own. I've sort of arrived at the same conclusion with a lot of the deals I've done. Maybe slightly different levers here and there, but ultimately, you want to put caveats or clauses within any deal that protects the interests of both parties, which I believe will also give a good outcome at the end of the day for the clients. There's an old saying goes that, you hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And you could do all the best due diligence in the world and find, and on the surface, it looks like, there's an alignment from a client value proposition perspective. There's an alignment from a fee going perspective, and it looks like, generally speaking, there's an alignment from a cultural perspective, but there could be an unknown factor that pops up, 6 months, 12 months into, or maybe well deeper into any sort of M&A arrangement. And I think it's just as important to have an out clause as it is. There's no sense in trying to force the issue on something that clearly is going to be a continual disruptor. So I'm of the belief that it is important to have something in there about how you get out of bed with one another as you do getting into bed. But and as far as the deferred payment arrangements, I think they help to. I think that they can help to cement the relationship as well, potentially incentivize the incoming advisors or the incoming business on helping the acquiring bed down relationships, preserving income, preserving relationships. If you wanted to take it a step further, although unlikely, you could potentially even incentivize for uplift in the value of the register. But I say unlikely because quite often people that are getting out of the industry might not be looking at this as a way to work harder or take on more responsibility. They're probably happy to service the clients they've got inside of any new arrangement. So, at least, incentivizing them to preserve their income, that's enough to get them off the table. But one of the things I do want to touch on is around restraint of trade. I think you just touched on it a little bit, but I think they're largely, I think it's kind of a weapon or a tool. I kind of refer to it as a weapon that is getting more and more outdated. Now, this is my own personal point of view, but the restraint of trades are really just this blunt force instrument that are quite negative in nature, and quite often don't stand up in courts of law these days. So again, you hope for the best but plan for the worst. Why not build a contingency into any deal that would stand the test of time and hold up in court, and build a buyback clause into the deal? So if for whatever reason the entity being acquired, whether it's a single plan or multiple planners, if they happen to exit that business after a few years and then a few years later again pop back up in the industry, that there's already an agreement in place that allows clients to follow that advisor back to wherever they've landed, but at an agreed valuation or agreed for an agreed amount.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you've mentioned that idea as well, Steve, that restraint of trade really has limited scope, but a buyback type arrangement might deal with it better.
Yeah, to the best of my understanding, it's never stood up in the Supreme Court. But non-solicitation does. What we look at is a restraint is a blunt tool, and it is losing its impact. So you'd say, okay, you're restrained from trade for 3 years, for instance. Now you can strengthen that by cascading it to 3, 2, 1. So if you do come to court, then the judge will decide what level of remuneration you received and what level is appropriate for restraint, because you can't stop someone working their trade. So that's the hardest part. But the way that we often will go address this, because this is normally the buyer's biggest fear, is that solicitation or non-solicitation has been upheld. What we try and do is avoid the courts altogether on this, and we do it on a client by client, which is a buyback. Let's just assume that the clients have been acquired at, say, 2.5 times recurring revenue. And if for whatever reason the vendor comes back to market and in the same area, but even now geography is not that important, but so it comes back to the industry, the client owns the client, so they can decide who they want to deal with. So what you have is a relatively punitive arrangement that if you've sold at 2.5 and you set up again, then you buy back those clients at, say, 3 times. Yeah. That prohibits aggressive behaviour. It's it can be done on a client by client basis rather than having to use the court system as well.
Yep. I think that's wise counsel. Let's get on to the last part of this, which is, I think, one of the most important, which is integrating. This is where you're going to extract the maximum value from the price of trade. So, Gordon, what are the biggest learnings you've sort of experienced, come across about how to best integrate? How do you keep the vendor in there? How do you learn to work with him, etc.?
Look, I mean, I think the natural response anyone would expect is, start talking about, systems and processes and all that sort of stuff. But again, we've started to touch on it, and it's going to be a recurring theme. But you've got to start with that cultural alignment, those values. But you've also got to understand why the entity or why the individual or why the practice that is getting out, what's motivating them to get out. Are there extenuating circumstances? Have they lost their AR? Have they have they fallen ill? Do they have to take care of someone? Are they just approaching retirement, or is it that they actually want to be part of a bigger organization? Like, what is, and that they can feel that they're, rather than them battling to do it themselves, if they can go into a bigger organization, participate as part of a larger entity, sit on a board of advice, really. So when you're talking about integration, definitely finding out and like I talked about the acquiring entity before, what's motivating them and driving them to want to scale up. But in this part, it's just as important to identify why the person that wants to get out or doesn't want to run their own business anymore is doing that. And then I touched on, even as part of the previous part, I touched on making sure that the business has a business plan, so it's clear to you on how that business operates. But I think that all forms part of, it's part of any successful transition. There's got to be complete transparency and 100% clarity, and that clarity around purpose and why things are happening on both sides. So you're sharing that story, as Steve was alluding to, and you can quite often do that in the first setting. But from there, it allows you to start building a framework that each person understands the lane that they're going to be swimming in throughout the process. And so throughout the honeymoon period, throughout the basically the fact find period of that conversation, through to any sort of NDA and any sort of deal being done, and then even post completion, and then I think once everyone is clear on their purpose, including staff that are going to be brought along the way, you're going to give yourself the best opportunity to be successful in integrating. So it's not just all about systems and processes. I think personally, there's got to be a lot of work and a lot of emphasis on other areas, even before you start talking about systems and processes.
I really like this idea of making it as transparent and clear to the clients as to what's happening and why, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that can walk away. and if they understand their interests are at the forefront of this, then again you'll enhance the likelihood of success. Now, we don't have that I can see any open questions coming through, so I'll keep asking questions. But if anybody else has got questions, we've got 4 or 5 minutes still remaining. I'd be keen to hear what you want to know from these guys. So, Steve, what do you think? Integration. What are the I know in our discussions you said you spend a bit of time following on, making sure that these transactions that you broker are successful. What's the sort of the measures of success from your point of view?
Final payment, basically the fulfillment of expectation. It means that we've got exactly what both parties were set out to achieve. If I could just make a comment, I'm in absolute agreement with Gordon there. We actually ask for a transition plan when we call for indicative non-binding offers. So we want to know what the buyer's going to do with the business, and to ensure that it's aligned with the vendor. Now, the vendor's retention can quite often be largely dependent upon the number of clients. How long does it take to hand over these clients and these relationships? It can be a lot more than just one meeting. It can be several meetings before that trust and confidence is transferred to the acquirer. But the shared vision, there needs to be a shared vision of both buyer and seller as to what the client's experience is going to look like. I'd slightly sort of say that you'd never say that the business has been sold. The business has always been merged, so clients don't feel like chattel. But key to both the buyer and the seller is the vision that this business is and what it's going to look like in 3 years. And so that the buyer and seller have a shared vision. It's with that vision that the vendor will get trust and confidence that the buyer's taking the clients down the right path. The buyer will get confidence that the vendor is advocating. There is going to be change, but it's an agreed change. There's an agreed vision of what the vendor's business version 2 is going to look like.
Yeah, okay. And look, I think, Gordon, you're absolutely on spot with what Steve's just said. So there seems to be great alignment between the two of you. You mentioned, Gordon, that you'd like the vendor to remain within the business longer than 12 months. Just want to comment on that length of tenure.
Yeah, look, I still think the industry's got some prevailing headwinds that we've got to face into, and so I just talked about it. Where again, if you're upfront and transparent about this, I really don't think it should be an issue for maybe a 2 or 3 year, so 24 or 36 month window in which they stay within the business. Particularly if that sort of aligns with future payments. But there's been I'll come back to it. There's been significant disruption in the industry where we're still facing into a change that's still expecting more change, but we've just been through life insurance framework. So if you're acquiring a business that's heavily involved in life insurance, but you get a run on the book in year 2 of insurance drop off, then yes, you might have a deferred payment, but having that person there actually might then allow them, if they've got an established relationship, going back in front of that client, either re-establishing the insurance or bedding down the relationship so that there's other opportunities in place. But we're still, next year we're still going to deal with potential additional changes to that life insurance framework and the superannuation review. So I think if you can just have people swimming in their lanes, they know exactly what they're doing, I don't think it should be too much of an issue, but it allows the business some time in what is still a disruptive period to give themselves the best chances to overcome those challenges and let the clients know that their interests are still forefront of sort of arrangement or change.
Well, guys, look, I'm going to have to wrap it up there. If we can grab the results of the poll up just quickly, just so that we can see if that's available. So it looks like the three main ones are identifying and valuing the book, evaluating the risks inherent in the purchase, integrating the clients into my business. And I think they're sort of areas that we definitely touched on as we went through this. So look, there'll be areas that we will look to focus on over the next 12 months, and we might get various people to come in, help us dig a little bit deeper into those areas. But I just want to thank Gordon and Steve for your time and for your insights. I think this has been a really good session. And I'm going to, with that, close our session and hand you back to James.